Today we have Eze Abosi. He is a graduate of Harvard's Economics and Management program and the current Chief Growth Officer of Hallmusk, which is a Series B stage medical technology company that works with clinical data. And so on that note, please say anything you want about yourself and your work.
So thank you so much for having me on the Blue Swan podcast, Sean. And so again, as a bossy, generally about 20, 22 years in one topic and one topic alone, which is life sciences specific data analytics, platform and consulting services. And so I'm fairly well versed at this topic. And so I have supported really all aspects, if you will, of the healthcare as well as the life sciences or pharmaceutical specific value chain. And so I'm former Optum. I was a vice president of new products and partnerships there. Spent some time at IQVIA, which is a 500-pound gorilla in this space, if you will. Spent about 11 years with one company called Decision Resources Group, or DRG, as it was known as. And they were acquired, they folded into a company called Clarivate. That's another major kind of player in the broader space. And so again, just coming at this conversation with an interest in health across the board, but also how data analytics and really just novel approaches to the aforementioned can help to better patient outcomes, consumer outcomes, or just the individual. In terms of what I'm doing today, I'm part of the Hallmusk team. We're an Optum Ventures company, Series B, as you mentioned, and I lead sales, marketing, service, but we are uniquely positioned as a company that's deeply focused in neuropsychiatry and neuroscience.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we touched a little bit on sort of the intersection of the clinical data that Hallmusk works with, ranging from major psychiatric disorders in Axis 1 to personality disorders in Axis 2, and then also the intersection of that with genomic data and clinical outcomes. And I'm wondering if you can discuss that intersection.
Yeah, absolutely. So Hallmusk, again, uniquely focused on neuroscience and neuropsychiatry, but the company was really built in neuropsychiatry. There are two sides to our business. Call it supply and demand. The demand is the researcher. The researcher is often parts of an academic institution. It could be part of a health system or provider entity. Certainly could be somebody in life sciences or a pharmaceutical company that's either developing a drug or that's commercializing a drug. And so that's demand. The supply side is the provider itself, usually the medium to larger hospital system that's based in the US. And so those companies essentially participate in our data ecosystem. What we do very uniquely, though, is we specialize in enriching. We specialize in enriching the psychiatric and neuroscience data associated with those patients or patients under management from those particular provider entities. And so I give you that background because it's very similar to other companies, most notably Optum. Optum Life Sciences is a very similar approach, but they work across all therapeutic categories and diseases where we're deeply focused in CNS, point one. Secondarily, like Optum Life Sciences, although a patient may at one point in their diagnostic journey be diagnosed with schizophrenia or depression or anxiety or substance use disorder, we often get or have access to all of the medical records, primary care as well as specialty, across the different channels in that hospital partner. And so we often see emergency room visits. We see visits in the true kind of hospital inpatient setting. We see visits across various outpatient clinics, and we have a whole lot of labs. And so that's super interesting because although people think about Hallmusk as a neuropsychiatric and neuroscience company, you can do analyses on really any disease category. And so the Oxford collaboration was super interesting from my perspective, first and foremost, because it's in a renowned academic institution based in the UK that wants to work with a US data set. And so kudos to our team for what we built there and how being able to attract a research institution like Oxford to work with it. But we were focused on GLP-1s. And so at this particular time, GLP-1s were really on the upswing in the US marketplace. And the value proposition was clear in terms of the patient, certainly the manufacturer, as well as just the overall kind of benefits to the ecosystem. And so when it comes to cardiometabolic factors like HbA1c, weight, certainly, and the listing goes on, like GLP-1s were certainly resonating and having a clear impact in the US marketplace. But We were interested, likewise the Oxford researchers, of not so much causation, because that's a much more rigorous approach to the analysis, but if there's a correlation between GLP-1 utilization and mental health, if you will, cognitive outcomes. And so our data set, although again built to support neuroscience and CNS research, our data set was able to really yield some meaningful results on GLP-1s, not only in terms of the applications and the impact on your physical health, but also in terms of your cognition, like your ability to function, as well as more psychiatric comorbidities or implications such as anxiety, such as depression and the like. A healthcare ecosystem like the US, which tends to look at the patient in silos, and that silo is by disease. How it's possible to still consider the importance of one disease, but really look at the patient holistically and link, if you will, physical health to brain health. And so we did that with our partners at Oxford. I think we did it very successfully in our GLP-1 analyses that, again, had a very tangible approach to assessing physical health indicators, as well as including mental or cognitive implications.
And would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on some of the details between the crossover between the physical and mental health? And so in terms of what's public facing right now for the research, there's basically the cover page, and it's got a brief graph of rates of obesity in different populations, ranging from no mental health diagnoses to anxiety or depression, bipolar, schizophrenia.
So we spent a lot of time thinking about this, Sean. And so for it's I don't want to make this sound rudimentary, but this is like the chicken and egg conundrum. Because for example, just sticking with the cardiometabolic health and let's say obesity, is a patient depressed because they're obese, or are they obese because they're depressed? But what we have done at Hallmusk and what other companies are doing really well in physical health, especially, is we're building a foundational data set that can help you understand either side of the coin. And in other words, from a more data science perspective, if you have a patient with chronic, moderate to severe depression, what are the implications on their weight? Maybe by gender, maybe by race. What are those implications also on their HbA1c or other physical health parameters? And so if you're a researcher that really wants to lean in and understand that, the good news is there's an asset, there's a capability that can help you do the analysis. And the inverse is also true. And so if you are a patient that is obese with a certain BMI of a given threshold, how does your state of depression travel with your obesity diagnoses? And so the inverse is also true. And so I can't necessarily comment on.
I think this just froze. No, it's still frozen. Okay.
And so the genesis is, Sean, that in CNS broadly, it has been really tough to measure patient outcomes the same way that a researcher could in a disease category like diabetes or cancer. What we are trying to do at Hallmusk and what some other very notable companies and missions are trying to do is elevate in central nervous system disorders this to the same level as what you would expect in other physical health, if you will, topics or physical health measures.
Okay. And so there's a lot of overlap, especially within drug development and clinical work between the research universities like Oxford and Stanford and any of the biotech companies, whether it's a Ty Beckley or Johnson and Johnson. And so Hallmusk has a number of partners that, ranging from Bristol Myers Squibb to a Ty Beckley. But is there a chance you can touch on some of the collaborations you're doing in terms of psychedelic drug development. And part of this is because I believe psilocybin is in phase 3, and that's
Yeah.
through a Tyvekly.
So you're partially correct. And so the phase 3 lead asset is psilocybin. It's a company called Compass Pathways, which I believe originates from the UK. And so they're British companies. We know them well. So and then the next most, I want to say, relevant in the pipeline is a company called Cybin, with another Cybin or psilocybin formulation that is fairly close in terms of development to the Compass lead asset, but a Tyvekly is certainly there. And I think they're moving forward in late stage trials, and they're very much looking forward to reporting hopefully positive data that gives patients another option. And when it comes to healthcare or life sciences broadly, from my perspective, there's medical device. There are a suite of medical technologies that often help to either expedite diagnosis or potentially present like a non-pharmaceutical option to treating and managing disease. Those are fantastic. And then, of course, there's drug. Pharmaceuticals, traditionally small pills, could be vaccines, could be biologics. But now there's kind of this emerging class called the psychedelics. From the perspective of Hallmusk, it's a life sciences organization. The mode of partnership, the mode of support in terms of differentiating evidence for how their intervention may positively impact or address an unmet need within a population like depression or anxiety, or there's really not much of a difference in how we engage a psychedelic company versus a more traditional biotech versus a multinational giant like a Johnson and Johnson or Bristol Myers Squibb. And I would say that is absolutely purposeful, not only because they have very similar business questions at the end of the day, but many of these smaller companies, whether they're because a psychedelic firm is ultimately a biotech, whether it's a biotech or a small cap pharma company, they tend to have staff that have worked for the large pharma companies. And so they have certain expectations. They know what good looks like when it comes to evidence generation or data and analytical capabilities. And although it's a smaller scale, although they may not have the tremendous budgets that some of these entities do manage, they have the same expectation and ultimately the same business questions. So it's very consistent. And that's what I hope is a good thing, is that whether you are supporting psilocybin drug development, ibogaine drug development, MDMA is super interesting. I don't know if you're familiar there, but that is progressing in trials as well. Or the kind of the next generation of, the term is escaping me, but ultimately I think many companies, the goal is to more so isolate the medical properties of psychedelics and, if you will, potentially counterbalance the hallucinogenic properties and really just isolate, if you will, the medicine. And so those second generation anti-psychedelic therapies, those are super interesting, and there are plenty of those in the pipeline. And many of the big, because they're just different issues that they have to manage, such as federal statutes and scheduling of said drug. There are many different issues they have to manage versus their big pharma peers.
Okay. And so did you want to like repeat the like 30 seconds to minute before what you just finished? The video cut out. Okay. There. See.
And freezing. I mentioned last time, they're putting in natural gas in my neighborhood, and it's absolutely impacting. Is this good?
Yeah, so it's usually good. It freezes and then it unfreezes and it's just been doing it throughout the call.
It's been good. I'm so sorry.
Okay. No worries.
I'm just waiting till what
Um,
seems to be a stable signal. Go ahead.
okay. Oh yeah, so if you wanted to repeat like that section you just went over, I'd be happy to put that back in since it froze.
Absolutely. Yeah, and really, in summary, the engagement of a novel psychedelic firm developing psilocybin, developing MDMA, which is super interesting as well, developing ibogaine, the mode of engagement when it comes to data analytics and really services that help you showcase either unmet need or help you commercialize your own stuff. The difference is minimal. The mode or the approach to engagement is very consistent as we would take with a biotech or with a large pharma company like a Johnson and Johnson or Pfizer. It's very consistent. I will note that's more so in the R&D phase. I will note though that commercialization is very different for psychedelic firms because of overarching federal policy, local states policies that may need to be amended to ensure proper access to the molecule or the intervention. We do a lot of work in understanding safety and side effects of therapeutics, and that is going to be a topic of high interest to the psychedelic manufacturers to in terms of gathering evidence that not only is the drug efficacious at managing and improving the symptoms, if not severity, of the indication that the FDA potentially approved it for, but it's safe. And so, yeah, those are just some of the topics that differentiate traditional kind of pharmaceutical engagement versus the nuances of working with a psychedelic firm. But very exciting from my perspective, more options for the patient, especially in CNS disorders, are a good thing. And what's really unique is with psilocybin in particular is the side effect profile or the lack thereof side effects. That's super.
It's ironic the harm dependency scale puts psilocybin at the very bottom and that existing treatments such as benzodiazepines, which may or may not be used in a comorbid condition for psilocybin treatment, are to actually have a higher rating on a harm dependency scale, both physically and psychologically.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that the key factor in Hallmark's operations is data enrichment. And so can you touch on how the data enrichment intersects with the evolution of AI drug development? And so there's development, there's commercialization, and AI drug development is actually pretty interesting because AI has exploded everywhere in pretty much any facet of technology, but AI drug development is stalled at about phase 2A. And in spite of many AI drugs that have been identified, the commercialization and the research of getting it to that point has been a lot slower. And yeah, I'm all ears.
Yeah. All right. Where do I even start? And so let me just maybe say some broader comments about the value chain. And so upstream, like a novel drug discovery, very high failure rates because most pharmaceutical entities don't make it to market. There's a very high failure rates. And so you want to de-risk that process as much as possible. Part of de-risking the process is ensuring you have the highest quality data and the highest quality information to make decisions on. Because it's one thing to isolate a molecule, whether it's a small molecule, whether it's a biological or vaccine. It's one thing to pharmaceutical, but boy, the amount of time, effort, and work that goes into prioritizing appropriate clinical trial is phenomenal. And top of the funnel, very upstream, you need very high quality data. Then you go downstream to like commercial marketing, being able just to ensure you raise awareness, you initiate prescriptions, and you do your best to support adherence to the prescribed regimen for the patients. There, you may not need as much precision in terms of the highest quality data to make a decision. There, it's all about breadth. You need to have the highest volume. Generally, there are going to be nuances and use cases. You need to have the highest volume possible. That way you can understand, for example, US prescribing at the national level, and then be able to drill down to, let's say, just the region that is Southern California, or drill down to the MSA that is New York City or New York Metro. And this claims data, insurance claims data, is incredibly powerful for many commercial use cases because it's just so vast. The top of the funnel is 200 million, 300 plus million at times. So I should say claims data, very broad, very vast. Clinical data that comes from the EHRs, that tends to be much smaller in terms of the patient populations it captures, but the value can be paramount. Why? Because you can understand, for example, the full patient journey, the symptoms that led to a physician encounter, the reasons for diagnosis, the interventions initially proposed to manage that diagnosis, as well as reasons for adding, switching, or discontinuing a drug. And so clinical data is often very limited in terms of the scope, but incredibly powerful in terms of what insights it can deliver. And so going back to the pharmaceutical value chain, clinical data is one of the most powerful tools that you can leverage as you are discovering drugs. And touching on AI, you need to apply your AI algorithm to some data set. And so if you can find a high quality clinical data set to apply your AI, that is generally one of the best ways of de-risking to the best of your ability the clinical research process, as well as just the very start of it, which is the discovery process. And so at Hallmusk, although our data is aggregated, which allows us to have more scale than usual for the therapeutic area that we serve, although our asset is aggregated, what we want to ensure quality that often supports the clinical trials, quality that often supports the economic arguments that you might present to a policy holder, support your drug, your drug's approval, if not access. But we also want to present a quality enough assets that certain functions that support the very far upstream discovery process are able to consider our asset as something they can deploy a model on to, let's say, better characterize patients and understand where there are opportunities to develop a drug that can suit a particular patient population that is not currently well served. And the next part is going to be ensuring the data can have novel AI approaches applied to it. And we are very open to that. And so from our perspective, various machine learning techniques, our techniques have been peer reviewed and published. It's very unique. And so we tend to have many different approaches and conversations with our clients on how that may be applicable to your translational process, for example. But above and beyond that, moving forward is all about the LLMs. And so really being able to take advantage of speed, yet scale, and still have a very high rate of efficacy, that's where we're focused. And that can be applicable across the value chain, from discovery through translational, all the way through clinical developments and the medical strategy process, as well as in the commercialization of the formal asset. And so we are very open and absolutely leveraging AI. And we're certainly very interested in having conversations with partners that can leverage our unique assets, not so much to discover drugs, because we'd be really good at characterizing patient populations, but to, for example, have identified patient populations that would be well suited for your candidate.
Okay. And the interesting thing about Hallmusk is that since it's a data-centric company, the distribution is very different than just primary therapeutics. And so between payers, pharma, and physicians, would you mind touching on like how the value chain and the economics of distribution are unique?
As our two primary stakeholders in the US healthcare ecosystem are payers and life science organizations, and specifically researchers. I kicked off the conversation by using the very rudimentary the supply versus demand. And so moving on the supply being the provider, the hospitals they partner with, one of the reasons why they choose this little company in New York called Hallmusk, it's because we're really good at working with, normalizing, and curating behavioral health, mental health, and basically CNS data in a way that only some of us can appreciate. And so once they understand our capability, the health system, for example, may want us to help them understand outcomes of patients under their management for internal benchmarking purposes. Let's say benchmarking one behavioral health clinic outcomes versus another behavioral health clinic outcome, but ultimately both behavioral health clinics are roll up to your enterprise or your health system. Service we provide quite often. Take that example and just scale it externally. And so being able to, across, let's say, all your lines of service, understand your depressive disorder patient outcomes versus another geography. That geography might be the US as a nation. That geography may be the state that your particular health system resides in, or the states that are applicable, or it might just be in your local geography. But our provider clients really do lean in and depend on us to leverage our expertise to support analysis of the patients that they're managing. Secondarily, we often are working with our provider clients to bring in life science collaborators for additional research opportunities. On the life sciences side, really three core, if you will, work streams that we tend to focus on. The first is really characterizing patients to support drug development. And so if your CNS disorders are starting to move towards the same type of specialization as autoimmune and cancer therapeutics, where the goal is not necessarily pursuing the disease in totality. You may want a subset of just the disease. And so not necessarily all asthmatics. Instead, you may be pursuing and developing a drug specifically for acute asthma, which is very common in today's pharmaceutical workflow. Using the example of cancer, not necessarily all lung cancer, but specifically PD-L1 positive non-small cell lung cancer that's stage 3 or higher. And so that's being able to really focus on a subpopulation for drug development that's becoming increasingly relevant to CNS. And so how does Homos fit in? We are, because of our vision of having the most robust asset for at scale understanding and characterizing patients with a CNS psychiatric and neurological disorder, you could actually stratify patients by symptom within an overall disease category in the neural asset. For that reason, we support drug development and all the different nuanced workflows that may ultimately roll up to drug development. And so that's use case number one. Use case number two, and this is no particular order, is the economic story. And so ultimately being able to use evidence, very high quality, curated evidence, to develop a story about about the positive impact of your company's intervention versus, let's say, standard of care. And so if I am, for example, developing a drug for anxiety, the standard of care may be benzodiazepines. And so in terms of efficacy, in terms of cognition and functioning, in terms of a better side effect profile, is my intervention compared to benzodiazepine. And so if you want to do that analysis, our capability in NeuroBlue would be super effective to conduct said analysis. And finally would be more so market access strategy. And ultimately payers, insurance companies are pretty big constituents of the US ecosystem. And so being able to use a credible third-party asset to create a value story to secure preferred access or preferred formulary, that's also a very tangible use case.
Interesting. And so how data actually work with the formulary side of things when it comes to insurance approvals? I guess that kind of struck me as something that, so it's like the difference between like a brand and a generic drug in terms of the mechanism of action is, I'm curious to know how that works, I guess more on the economic side and the procedural side.
Yeah, so the general thought process is how, although the specialty therapeutic the manufacturer is offering, although it's more expensive than the generic, how can I showcase clearly without tremendous bias? How can I showcase that the efficacy overall lowers cost for patients treated with my premium price specialty therapeutic versus a lower cost generic? And so in general, and so this is a sweeping generalization, and so there absolutely will be particular instances where I'm wrong, but in general, lower cost generics also have lower efficacy versus specialty therapeutics that are usually innovative and more recently, if you will, commercialized. And so, because of the cost, many times generics are preferred. But the art of market access and really creating a very robust formulary story to support preferred formulary placements is being able to paint a picture that although the specialty drug offered by my manufacturer is more expensive, once a patient is treated with this drug, overall costs are lower. Let me just use one example. I'm not a health economist, but I think there's one example that's a pretty good one. And so being able to log into our data set and compare metformin outcomes versus GLP-1 outcomes in terms of physiology. Sorry, I got a call there. So you might want to.
It's all good. We can wrap up if you want, and then also it started tracing again towards the end.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
It's freezing.
no, you have nothing to apologize for. I think if you had control over it, it wouldn't be freezing at all.
Indeed. And so, yeah, just quick pause.
Okay.
So when you compare GLP-1s to metformin, although metformin has been an effective treatment for many years, at this point it's generic and it's very low cost. GLP-1s, though, are premium priced, but based on the evidence that has been generated thus far, the value proposition versus metformin for the right patient is pretty clear. And so being able to conduct that formal analysis to present to an insurer to secure better formulary placement of my GLP-1, that's exactly what the use case is.
Okay. No, I think that's definitely a fair analogy, and much of that is just because there won't necessarily be a direct equivalent until the patent expiration of, in this case, the GLP-1 agonist in question. And that, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So is there anything else you wanted to touch on before jumping on the next call?
No, just wanted to just say, Sean, this has been a pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation here today. I think we hit on some really good points. And so thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the podcast.
It absolutely will be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.